I'm in a bit of a quandary today. I've been thinking about this ever since Stan MacDonald was on my show the other day. He's one of the interviews who was looking at legal maxims, and we did the ULEZ thing where he'd worked out how you could get round the ULEZ situation and knock it into a cocked hat. And if you haven't seen that interview, it is definitely worth seeing. And halfway through that, he dropped a bombshell, which I've been thinking about for some time. I actually made a little clip of the video and sent it to a number of people and to get their views on it. And they've come back, and I'm still not really happy with the answers. And I thought, ultimately, I'll put it to you, my lovely audience, and see what you think about this. It's about the King, King Charles III. So as far as I'm understanding, and I'm no expert on any of this, and I put my hands up, I'm no expert, but when the king is coronated or crowned, has his coronation, and he has his crown, and he says his oath to the people, and he promises to obey the customs and traditions of the land and uphold the law and act as the head of state and be the defender of the faith, or in his case, the defender of all the faiths. I'm not quite sure if there's any faiths that would be excluded from that list. You may have all sorts of different faiths, one of which you may be somebody who perhaps pays tribute to Satan and people like that. And I don't know if he's defending those sort of faiths, which would be a little bit worrying if that was the faith that he was then defending. But we'll leave that to one side for the moment. So in my understanding, that when Queen Elizabeth II died, he was, by the process of elimination, the next in line to the throne. He had been the Prince of Wales, and then he became the king. But he wasn't fully fledged the king until he'd been crowned and said his oath. Now, presumably that means that in the interim time he's sort of a bit of a standby king. So he probably had still a diary of engagements, maybe stuff that his mother had it in the diary. But it would mean that he could turn up and cut a ribbon at a shopping centre or these sort of places, or unveiling a plaque on behalf of a certain charity and turn around and wave at people, and all the stuff that very important stuff that kings do, a lot of this hand waving and things like that these people do. But until he was actually coronated, till he'd had his crown put on and he'd said his oath, in my mind he's not fully fledged. He's not a fully fledged king. Now, if that's the case, should he be able, before that moment, to put anything the government puts together and give royal assent to, unless it was an emergency, an emergency situation where they needed certain new laws passed? Should he be able to give anything, any new act, a royal assent, when, in my mind, technically he's not a fully fledged king? Now, the reason I say that is because in March, these are 2 months before he had his coronation, which was May the 6th, you may remember. In March, he passed an act that the government had drawn up, which was called the Precision Breeding Act, an act in which it is now permissible to muck about with the genomes of animals and plants. I don't know if humans are in that, whether you're allowed to muck about with the genomes and the DNA of humans, but certainly with animals and plants to create a new kind of food, which in my mind is like the Frankenstein foods, of which is probably not terribly wholesome and healthy. And a lot of people will be a bit worried and concerned about that. When he passed this act, he could have waited, because it's not like an emergency. There was no great rush for it. He could have waited until after his oath and his official crowning. So I just wonder whether that's a legitimate thing. Stan MacDonald said that he was acting fraudulently, that he shouldn't have had the power to act as head of state, even though he was like the stand-in king. but he wasn't fully fledged, and I don't know, and maybe you do, maybe there's somebody there who knows whether that is possible, that he could act as head of state and allow, through royal assent, certain acts to pass. The reason I say this is because presumably if he had waited till after May the 6th and he'd had his coronation and he allowed this to go into law by his royal assent, acting as the first among equals, as it were, us being the rest of them, that if he had done it after that point, we the people could go, oh, actually, do you know what? Although you're sort of acting on our behalf as head of state, etc., we all disagree with that and we don't want it. A bit like a chairman, I suppose, of a company in which the shareholders, the chairman is doing what he thinks is right and the shareholders are going, no, good on you, you get on with it, we're not really that bothered. But if the chairman was to sign into power with the corporation, the funding that the shareholders are funding, or whatever that is, something they disagreed with, the shareholders, I believe, could get together and say, actually, we're not happy about this, we don't want this policy that you've just signed into operation. And I wonder if that's the same with the subjects, that after May the 6th, once he'd taken his allegiance to the people and he put into through royal assent an act that the people disagreed with, whether they would then legitimately be able to say, no, 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 we don't want that, revoke it. But because he did it before the oath, and this is where I feel it becomes a little bit of a grey area, and maybe it is fraudulent, because he did it before the oath, maybe the people cannot go back to this and say, we don't want that, which would be a sort of nefarious way of bringing an act that the people don't want into existence. But then I still question whether he was fully fledged enough as a king to be able to do a royal assent on any act whatsoever. So that's the conundrum that I'm in. And maybe somebody out there can tell me, was the king acting fraudulently? And if, as Stan MacDonald says, he was, it means in the legal maxims that if you've done one fraudulent thing, anything else, any other acting of putting things through royal assent would also be fraudulent, because you've set this standard. You've acted fraudulently, therefore everything else is deemed to be fraudulent. And as Stan MacDonald said, in order to be able to actually have another royal assent of any of the acts of government to be true and proper, you would have to get yourself another king, which of course would be William. And so I'm throwing this out there as a conundrum. Maybe it's perfectly legitimately, and I'm not suggesting it isn't, but maybe it is a question. Can you put into act through the royal assent if you've not yet been crowned and said your oath? Answers on a postcard or in the comments below, and let me know what you think.